The small right hand rose stiffly. Behind him, Robert Kennedy's face crinkled in pain, and spectators crumpled as though struck. Of all Monday's images, nothing approached the force of John's salute. Hello, you guys, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess, and if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription today. Well, today is a great day. We are finishing up William Manchester's book that was serialized in Look magazine called The Death of a President. And this is going to be the last installment that we will do on my channel. We had all 4 magazines. We have gone through them, and wonderfully, for those of us who like things to be nice and tidy, this is episode 10. So we have a series of 10 articles. So if you've missed them, you'll want to go back and catch them all because he is an excellent writer. He has walked us through Kennedy's initial flight into Texas, the tour that they did of other cities in Texas, the morning of, before the assassination, the motorcade itself, the assassination itself, the situation at Parkland Hospital, back to Love Field, the flight to Washington that was tension-filled, the autopsy at Bethesda, etc. He's given us such great look. He's had over 1,000 interviews, is what I believe he said, recorded in 40 notebooks. So this is his account, and we are grateful for it. I do want to let you guys know something wonderfully fun. So you might notice there are some new books here. If for those of you who look carefully at those things, I'm found that there are some of you who love to look at the background and tell me about the messy things or when the cat shows up down here. So I found some really neat things at the bookstore last night, and 2 of them were Kennedy-related signatures. So one of them, I found a book, and I actually bought it. It's here somewhere, by Jean Hill, who was one of the observers. She was called the Lady in Red, standing by the motorcade. She was the person physically closest to the president and Jackie when the fatal shot happened. So she was there in a red coat right at the street side, Jean Hill. So her signature is on the book that she wrote. So I feel very grateful to have gotten an autographed copy. Very cool, probably because I'm here in Dallas. And so my assumption would be that at some point she came through. Maybe she's still from Dallas. But anyway, I have that. And then in a different random book that I was looking at, and I did not purchase this one, but it was the signature of Nellie Connolly. She signed Mrs. John B. Connolly. And so that was just really fun to have last night as I was browsing at the bookstore, that close connection with 2 people in this very story. So I just wanted to share that with you. It kind of made me geek out internally a little bit, and I knew some of you would be excited as well. Well, let's go ahead and get right into this. So Look magazine, I have been so grateful for the way that they collected this story for us. It's been wonderful. It's literally just walls of text. So I am not withholding from you some vast number of photos. It is just the text, and we are moving through it, but the details have been so vivid and so excellent that I haven't, I always love photography, but I really haven't missed it because it's just been so valuable to read this thorough, hearty, approved of collection of details that William Manchester did. Again, I will remind you, this was the only account that was requested by Jackie. And when she requested it, he took time away from his normal job, I believe for nearly 3 years, to detail each and every individual. He spoke to as many people that had any connection to that day as he could, took tons of interview notes, and produced this. So, William Manchester, the final selection from Look magazine. Reading the thoughts of a stricken man is difficult. Nevertheless, it was becoming increasingly clear to those around Joseph P. Kennedy that he sensed something was wrong. Ted Kennedy had told him that he was back in Massachusetts for a speech. Yet Ted had gone off to the 8 o'clock mass with Eunice Shriver. The television set was inoperable. Joe Kennedy gestured impatiently at his niece, Anne Gargan, and she realized that he had noticed the absence of any morning newspaper. Okay, so we have not heard yet about Joseph P. Kennedy, and in fact, the next two videos after this one are both related to Joseph P. Kennedy. But he, at this point, had fallen prey to a stroke, I believe, but was still mentally present. And so the niece, Anne Gargan, whose brother, Joey Gargan, showed up all as the source of information in the book Chappaquiddick. He was Ted's cousin who was there present that night at the party at Chappaquiddick. His sister Anne was the one who did this daily, hourly duty of caring for Joseph P. Kennedy in his final, I believe, 8 years. I think she gave 8 years of her life to just being his basically personal assistant and nurse during that time. Now, he had a nurse who took care of most of the physical things, but Anne would get him to eat, I believe, and she was his companion and caretaker during 8 years of her life and the final 8 years of his. So he knew that Ted was coming for a speech, but now all of a sudden there's no news. There's no newspapers. What's happening? Feebly, she explained that Frank, the family chauffeur, had been unable to pick them up because he had driven Aunt Rose to church. Joseph Kennedy's eyes sharpened. Then he looked out through the dining room's big picture window and saw his wife emerging from the foggy lawn, dressed all in black, her face obscured by a black veil. He made a queer, jerky movement that Anne believed later was a sign that he had felt the first wave of impending disaster. The truth couldn't be kept from him much longer. Ted knew it, and after breakfasting, the senator asked Eunice to join him in their father's bedroom. By now, the tension in Joe was alarming. He had been impatient with Anne and the nurse throughout his regular exercise period in his indoor pool. Back in his bed, he stirred restlessly and glared at the dark television screen. As a precaution, his physician, Dr. Russell Bowles, had been summoned from Boston and was lurking down the hall within earshot. Ted and Eunice entered and sat by the bed. Joe waved indignantly at the screen. The senator turned toward it, explaining that they had all been at Mass, and his father gazed out at the sea. In aphasia, a patient's mind often drifts that way. One moment, you have his undivided attention. A moment later, he is off in a private reverie. Ted said, "There's been a bad accident. The president has been hurt very badly." Joe Kennedy's head snapped back. He stared directly into his son's eyes. He was following every word. "As a matter of fact," Ted said, "he died." Several contemporary accounts declared that the president's father did not cry. That was untrue. The retired tycoon was deeply emotional, devoted to his children. When his oldest son had been killed in action, he had been well. Nevertheless, he had wept then, and he wept now. Ted and Eunice did their best to comfort him, but they too had been ravaged. It was a time of unrelieved desolation. After a while, Joe recovered sufficiently to ask for details. There were more tears, and Dr. Bowles advised Anne that immediate relaxation was imperative. I can't remember if somehow he was communicating. I think on a movie, maybe on Chappaquiddick movie, they show him as like having a chalkboard that he would write on, but I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think perhaps this is a little bit of dramatization. I don't know that he could ask any questions, but it does seem that he had capacity to understand. He just wasn't communicative, is what I believe was the case at this point in time. Unfortunately, that was impractical. He wouldn't be getting any relaxation prescribed by the doctor. There was no way his patient could be diverted now. Anne brought the Boston Globe and the Boston Record American into the bedroom. Her uncle saw the pictures from Dallas and collapsed again. The doctor entered and gave him a sedative. Like the drug Dr. Walsh had administered to Jacqueline Kennedy at Bethesda, it had no effect. Ted conferred with his brother by telephone. Bob agreed that he should stay there until their parents had settled down. The news having been broken, Anne thought her uncle might as well watch television. In 25 minutes, a Hyannis technician had repaired the wires Ted had violently yanked away the previous evening. Oh, Ted. And the president's father, propped up on pillows, was looking at his son's coffin in the East Room. Watching the honor guard change shifts, he began to sob again, and for the next several hours, indeed throughout most of the next 2.5 days, he alternated between a yearning for information and a revulsion against it. At his direction, Anne and Nurse Rita Dallas switched the knob on and off, on and off. The crisis came later in the afternoon. Word reached the compound of rumors that the president's father had died of a heart attack. Senator Kennedy debated the wisdom of calling a press conference to scotch the report and concluded it was best to say nothing. At the height of this frantic activity, Joe Kennedy decided he must go to Washington immediately. Anne stepped into the bedroom and found him struggling with his clothes and fumbling for his wheelchair. There was no way to dissuade him. Another elderly uncle might have been gently pushed back among his bedclothes, but nobody had ever pushed this man around, and his slender young niece didn't try. Instead, she helped him dress and wheeled him to the car. She suggested they just ride around. He vehemently refused and directed her straight to the airport. Had adequate transportation existed, there is little doubt that the president's father would have appeared in the White House within 2 hours. I just wanted to share with you guys, I do have this book actually by the nurse Rita Dallas that they just mentioned. She was the head nurse to Joseph P. Kennedy during the last 8 years of his life. And, I've thought about reading some of it with you all. So, I don't know, I might choose a few select portions out of this one. I was thinking about the account during Chappaquiddick could be interesting, and the account during this 1963 situation, just sharing her insights to what happened. Well, he was in an inflexible mood, and none of Anne's arguments impressed him. Since his stroke, however, Joe Kennedy had confined his flying to the Caroline. The plane wasn't there, so the two of them just sat in the gloaming, squinting at commercial airplanes until he signaled her to start the car. She drove slowly back to the compound and helped him back to bed. Adjusting covers, Anne had the feeling that in some undefinable way, the trip had helped him. He wasn't resigned. He remained inconsolable, groping in a solitary, unfathomable agony. But he had done something. He had tried. Saturday evening, Kenneth Galbraith and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. met again at the Averell Harriman's. Galbraith, still convinced that he would be the chief author of President Johnson's address to the joint session of Congress, described his first draft to Schlesinger. It was like putting his hand on the stove. Galbraith had taken the line that the issue was continuity, that the future, quote, was greater than the life of any one man. That was what the new president had told him, and he had taken the cue. Schlesinger felt this was heartless. He thought the speech ought to come down hard on Kennedy's achievements. In his journal, Galbraith observed that Arthur was in an appalling mood and spent a considerable part of the evening attacking me. Mrs. Kennedy sent for Bobby and said, "I have to see Jack in the morning. I want to say goodbye to him, and I want to put something in the coffin." He understood. It was a secret of his strength and a source of the special affection shared by those close to him that he never asked them for reasons. If you were a relative or a friend, that was enough. He assumed you knew what you were doing, and the franker you were, the better he liked it. He jotted down their Sunday schedule for her and said, "I'll come for you. We'll go down there together." After he had gone, Jacqueline Kennedy wrote her husband a letter. Later, she was uncertain about the precise time of composition. Medication and accumulated sleeplessness had blunted her perception, and the servants had drawn her drapes in the southwest corner of the presidential apartment so tightly that it was impossible to distinguish daylight from night. Now, in her darkened room, she wrote a final impassioned letter, filling page after page. Then she folded the paper and sealed the envelope. After Mass on Sunday morning, Jacqueline Kennedy and her brother-in-law went straight to the presidential apartment. She told her daughter, "You must write a letter to Daddy and tell him how much you love him." John was too little to write, so she asked him to mark his sheet as carefully as he could. It was, she said, to be a message for his father. Then, holding John's hand, Caroline helped him scribble up and down as best he could. It was wholly illegible, of course, but their mother, sitting on one of the little nursery chairs while Miss Shaw hovered over the children, saw that they were doing their best. Mrs. Kennedy had 3 envelopes now, theirs and her own. Yet the letters weren't enough. The impulse that had begun at Parkland, when she had fastened her wedding ring to his finger, had grown stronger. She had become obsessed by an urge to leave something he had treasured with him. There were, she now remembered, 2 gifts from her that he had really loved. Before their marriage, he had never been interested in men's jewelry. If he had needed a pair of cufflinks for a formal shirt, he would pick up a set in a drugstore. As a young girl, her own allowance had been rather small, and at the wedding, she had given him a briefcase. A year later, however, she had seen a beautiful pair of inlaid gold links in a New York show window. The price was staggering, $800, but she had splurged. It had been her first really expensive present to him, and it was a great success. He had worn them on every possible occasion and displayed them with pride. The second present had begun as a light gesture. During their second year in the White House, she had read a newspaper story about a man who had carved a likeness of the president. The craftsman's real specialty, the account went on, was scrimshaws, decorative articles carved from whalebone. She told Clint Hill, that is the man who climbed on the back of the vehicle in Dealey Plaza. He was her personal Secret Service agent. She told Clint Hill it might be rather nice to have a scrimshaw bearing the presidential seal. Clint found the man, and the result was an unexpected triumph. The man discovered an ancient bull whale's tooth, set it in timbers from a New Bedford whaling ship, and spent 180 hours embellishing it with an ornate early 19th century design of the seal. On Christmas 1962, their final Christmas together, Mrs. Kennedy had given it to her husband. That morning she had thought of it as just a little present, but he had been enchanted. Yeah, it does seem rather unique. It's a unique gift to begin with. Scrimshaw is a very rare art that's on a rare article. But then he was a man of Massachusetts and spent a lot of time at the sea. That's a wonderful gift. From that day forward, he had always kept it on the right-hand corner of his desk, and remembering how much it had meant to him, she had asked Evelyn Lincoln to send it up to her when they returned from Bethesda. Bearing the letters, the links, and the scrimshaw, she and Robert Kennedy descended to the first floor and entered the East Room. Robert Kennedy had alerted Godfrey McHugh. The general met them at the threshold. Clint closed the door while McHugh folded back the flag, unlatched the casket top, and glanced inside to be certain everything was all right. Closing it and replacing the field of stars, McHugh ordered Lieutenant Donald Sawtell to march the death watch out. Jacqueline heard him. She whispered to Bob, "No, they don't have to leave the room. Even though we're here, Jack would be so," she groped for a word, "lonely. Just tell them to go to a far corner and turn their backs." The Joint Services team had already started the withdrawal. McHugh had refolded the flag and was propping the lid open on its hinge. The Attorney General spoke to the retreating honor guard. "I don't want that," he said quietly, and the lieutenant halted his 4 men, ordered a left face, and executed one himself. Flanked by McHugh and Clint Hill, they faced the wall, at attention. Together, the president's widow and brother knelt by the open coffin. This was the first time Mrs. Kennedy had seen her husband since Parkland. "It isn't Jack, it isn't Jack," she kept thinking, and she was so glad Bobby had agreed to keep it shut. She put the letters, the links, and the scrimshaw in the coffin. Bob took off his PT tie pin. He said, "He should have this, shouldn't he?" "Yes," she whispered. Then he drew from his pocket an engraved silver rosary Ethel had given him at their wedding. Bob placed this with the letters. With a lock of her husband's hair, she went out with Bob. She was swaying visibly. Clint Hill was afraid she might faint. She didn't. She retained the sense of purpose that had kept her going for 2 days. Bob led her into the sharp turn towards the elevator to the second floor. The schedule was now inflexible. Young John, watching the body bearers, asked, "Mommy, what are they doing?" His mother said, "They're taking Daddy out." John asked, "But why do they do it so funny, so slow?" She said, "Because they're so sad." And the lieutenant looked away and forgot the clock. President Johnson entered, departed, and re-entered a deeply disturbed man. After attending church services with his wife and Lucy, he had arrived at the mansion, had been told by an usher that Dean Rusk wished to speak to him immediately on the telephone, and had heard from the Secretary of State what the entire country was learning, that Oswald had just been shot, quote, on television, end quote. In the Blue Room, Jean Smith whispered to Mrs. Johnson that she had overheard a servant say the assassin was dying. Johnson greeted the Attorney General, who knew nothing of this, with, "You've got to do something. We've got to do something. We've got to get involved. It's giving the United States a bad name around the world." We've already seen this man's absurdity, his intensity, his self-focus, his self-aggrandizing. But for him to, in this moment, be putting any pressure at all on the brother of the slain president is absurd, to say the least. In the weeks that lay ahead, Oswald's death, and especially the manner of his dying, were to loom ever larger until they had assumed undeserved dimensions. At the time, this was untrue. The attention of the national audience was focused on the north portico of the White House. The murder of the assassin almost seemed to be an intrusion. To Robert Kennedy, President Johnson's protest that the United States was getting a bad name around the world was untimely. The Attorney General afterward remembered that, "I thought at the time that it couldn't be the thing foremost in my mind." Yeah. Duh, LBJ. That man has no insight into the human realm of emotion or empathy. But not only that, there's a cruelty about his behavior that, like I've said before, doesn't just strike me. I mean, I'm not diagnosing anybody. I don't have that skill. But it strikes me as very similar to someone who is narcissistic or even sociopathic. It's like a complete lack of awareness of what anybody else might be feeling in such a moment. Dick Goodwin, a summa cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School, felt an unprofessional disinterest. Quote, "Complete indifference. I wouldn't have cared if I'd been told that Connolly had been charged with the shooting." Sarge Shriver picked up the receiver, put it down, and announced, "Somebody just shot Oswald." No one in the office said a word. "We went on," Goodwin put it, "with our business." In the car behind the caisson, which was bearing John Kennedy's body toward Capitol Hill, Mrs. Kennedy said suddenly, "Oh, Lyndon," breaking for the first and last time her vow never to call him by his first name. "What an awful way for you to come in." The new president said nothing. Throughout the ride, both he and Mrs. Johnson were speechless. Robert Kennedy was also silent. Caroline and John were subdued. And to the best of everyone's recollection, Jacqueline Kennedy's consoling remark was the only comment in the lead limousine. In the rotunda, after the eulogies, Lyndon Johnson stepped forward for the ritualistic wreath placing by the President of the United States, paused in momentary prayer, and returned to his place. Except for the muted sobbing of a sergeant, 2 colonels were leading him to an anteroom, the great rotunda was silent. The plans had ended here. The 14-minute ceremony was over, and suddenly Mrs. Kennedy, who had felt faint and was swaying slightly, realized everyone was waiting for her to leave first. She wasn't quite ready. Facing Robert Kennedy, she asked softly, "Can I say goodbye?" He nodded once, and she took Caroline by the hand. She felt rather awkward, but she didn't want it to end quite yet. To Caroline, she whispered, "We're going to go say goodbye to Daddy, and we're going to kiss him goodbye, and tell Daddy how much we love him and how much we'll always miss him." Mother and daughter moved forward, the widow gracefully, the child watching carefully to do as she did. Jacqueline Kennedy knelt. Caroline knelt. "You know, you just kiss," whispered Mrs. Kennedy. Eyes closed, they leaned over to brush their lips against the flag. Caroline's small gloved hand crept underneath to be nearer. And in that single instant, an entire nation was brought to its knees. The audience in the Rotunda, the national audience, those who until now had been immune, those who had endured everything else, were stricken in a fraction of a second. A chord deep in the hearts of men had been touched, and Justice William Douglas felt paralyzed. General Clifton, half blinded by his own tears, looked across the circle and saw the Joint Chiefs of Staff standing at attention, their faces set and their cheeks streaming. I mean, that's when you know it's bad, is when all the military men are losing it. Somehow LBJ is not, but all these military men who are trained not to crack at very tragic moments in time and have certainly been through battles, they're all just a mess. They're an emotional mess. Still clutching Caroline, Jacqueline Kennedy rose and stepped toward the door with simple majesty. The others stumbled after her. On the sidewalk by the waiting limousines, Mrs. Kennedy stepped over to Mrs. Johnson. She said, "Lady Bird, you must come to see me soon, and we'll talk about you moving in." Taken aback, the new First Lady replied, "Now there's one thing I want to say about that. I can wait till whenever you're ready." As she recalled later, the widow smiled faintly and said to her, "Any time after tomorrow. I won't have anything to do after that." Yeah, she had planned up to the moment, but now there's nothing to do. At 2:19, she entered her car. 6 minutes later, Frank McGee of NBC, who had withheld the news until now, confirmed that Lee Oswald had died. Jacqueline Kennedy hadn't even known he had been shot. The murder of the assassin, she thought, was, quote, "just one more awful," end quote. For the United States, the sole imperative was that Johnson swiftly create an atmosphere of confidence, and in that role he was proving superb. It didn't much matter that he was conjuring confidence, or that he himself may have suffered pangs of self-doubt. Wisely, he kept any stage fright to himself. Undoubtedly, he suffered from it, but only rarely did he permit anyone to peer behind his elaborate stage props and see hesitancy there. Secretary of the Treasury Douglas Dillon had a fleeting glimpse of it. The president and the secretary discussed the Secret Service and the walk from the executive mansion to St. Matthews. Since Oswald's murder strongly suggested an elaborate plot, we're told that it doesn't. We're told now that, Jack Ruby was just so moved by emotion he couldn't bear to see the widow Kennedy, blah, 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 blah. But here, at the moment, they all realize Oswald's murder strongly suggests an elaborate plot. Secret Service Chief James Rowley didn't want Johnson to follow the gun carriage on foot. At first, the president agreed, but then Lady Bird told me I should do it, he told Dillon, so I changed my mind. Ken Gilbreth was continuing to express his desolation in his own peripatetic fashion. He described with the pride of authorship his revised version of President Johnson's address. Observing Mrs. Kennedy's distress, British Ambassador Sir David Ormsby Gore quickly put in, "Make it as good as you can, obviously, but good as it will be, it won't match Kennedy's speeches." Galbraith replied, "As you are a loyal Tory, I am a loyal Democrat." The ambassador answered edgily, "On occasions of this sort, I am prepared to be a very disloyal Tory." Their laughter was brittle. Galbraith then turned to the widow's housing problem and solved it brilliantly. When she told him that she didn't know how much money she would have or when she would have it, he pointed out that Averell Harriman, quote, "has more real estate than he knows what to do with. He could buy a house in Georgetown and turn it over to you. It would be a sensible investment for him." Harriman volunteered to move his family to a hotel and turn his own Georgetown home over to Mrs. Kennedy. And after 3 telephone calls, Galbraith reported to Robert Kennedy that it had been settled that way. He reported to Bob, not Jackie, for by then she was once more absorbed in ceremonial details. To suggest that she was a complete mistress of herself would be inaccurate. She wavered, for example, over the design of the Mass card. Dr. Joseph English had set up prayers of St. Ignatius and St. Francis, and Ethel brought in a third from her parents' card. The widow said, "I don't want any of these on the back. I'm not going to be pleading with God to take Jack's soul to heaven." Ethel protested that there had to be some mention of God. Now, we've heard there's a book that some YouTubers have read about Ethel Kennedy, and she had a very interesting, very childlike interaction with the idea of God. But definitely in this moment, she's pressing for there to be some mention of God. And then Jackie did precisely what she said she would not do. She wrote out the plea. "Dear God, please take care of your servant, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Please take him straight to heaven." She meant both sentences to be included, but Bob, under the impression that she intended him to make a choice between the two, struck out the second. Other of her instructions miscarried or proved impractical. She specified a black border for the Mass card and didn't get it. Ethel was against black because she felt it should not be sad, not reminding you of death. Again, childlike, like reminding you of death. That's the reason we're all here, Ethel. For Jackie, that was the very purpose of the card, but it was too late. No printer could include a border in the time left. As it was, the only way White House social aide Sandy Fox could get the job done before the Mass was to use the Central Intelligence Agency press. The CIA agreed to run it through the night. Yeah, I guess they can make any kind of documentation, can't they? At whatever speed they wish to. I mean, funeral printers can't manage it, but the CIA can. When Fox reported this, everyone was dumbfounded. None of them had known the spies had a press. Yeah, that's because we all pay for it, but we have no idea what they do. True since 1963. Near the end of the funeral mass, Cardinal Cushing, to his own surprise as much as everyone else's, broke into English. It was, he said afterward, an inspiration, like Pope John calling the Ecumenical Council. I hadn't thought of it all before, but suddenly I wanted the human touch. He cried, "May the angels, dear Jack, lead you into paradise. May the martyrs receive you at your coming. May the Spirit of God embrace you, and mayest thou, with all those who made the supreme sacrifice of dying for others, receive eternal rest and peace. Amen." The new First Lady thought it, quote, a plea, almost a wail. It didn't betray the dignity of the scene, and yet there was a human note at last. The Cardinal's personal anguish was showing through. It wasn't just a ceremony anymore. He was saying goodbye to a man. Across the aisle, the widowed First Lady noticed that Cushing was crying. She looked away, and Caroline saw her tear-streaked face. The small hand reached up to clutch hers. Mrs. Kennedy heard her daughter say, "You'll be all right, Mummy. Don't cry. I'll take care of you." The casket team shouldered the coffin and bore it out. The band struck up "Hail to the Chief." This was the last time it would be played for President Kennedy. Jacqueline Kennedy, remembering how the boy had loved to play soldiers with his father, said, "John, you can salute Daddy now and say goodbye to him." The small right hand rose stiffly. Behind him, Robert Kennedy's face crinkled in pain, and spectators crumpled as though struck. Of all Monday's images, nothing approached the force of John's salute. Mrs. Kennedy, standing erect, missed it, and when she was shown the photographs afterwards, she was astounded. In the past, his saluting hand had been rather comic. He had used his left hand, bumping his nose on the way up and looking, in her words, sort of droopy. But not now. Somehow the mood and the meaning of the day had reached the president's son. His elbow was cocked at precisely the right angle. His hand was touching his shock of hair. His left arm was rigidly at his side. His shoulders were squared and his chin in. His bearing was military. and to see it in a 3-year-old with his bare legs stiff below his short coat, his knees dimpled, and his blunt red shoes side by side. To hear the slow swell of the music and recall how the president had idolized him was almost insupportable. Cardinal Cushing looked down on the small face. He saw the shadow of sadness crossing it and felt a burning sensation in his chest. 8 months later, he could scarcely speak of it. We're given the final look at their grief. It says, "At last, the 2 chief mourners were left alone on the 2nd floor of the mansion. 5 evenings ago, before riding across Memorial Bridge to attend his own birthday party, the Attorney General had talked to the First Lady here for nearly 45 minutes, inquiring whether she was sure she had recovered sufficiently from Patrick's death to endure the strain of the Texas trip and the campaigning ahead. Now, preparing to cross the river again, he needed no assurance. Like him, he knew she could survive anything, except the thought that the yesterdays binding them together might be forgotten. Therefore, with that understated manner that, as much as his voice stirred sudden memories of the president, he said quietly, 'Should we go visit our friend?' She always kept lilies of the valley in a little gold cup on the hall table, and she stopped to gather a spray. Clint Hill, still her Secret Service agent, even after Kennedy's death, phoned ahead to Arlington. Parking on Sheridan Drive, they walked up between cedar and oak to the new fence. The scene was sharply altered. The vast throngs had disappeared. Standing by the white pickets were the Kennedys, 2 military policemen, and the superintendent. It was, Clint noted, very damp and dark and quiet. One of the military policemen unlatched the gate. Jacqueline and Robert Kennedy stepped inside, and under the flickering torch he saw a green beret. An MP in the afternoon shift had left his black and white brassard on the evergreens. Beside it, a soldier of the 3rd Infantry had propped his buff strap and an old cockade, the symbols of a military tradition that went back to the Revolutionary War. Bob silently pointed to them, and she nodded. Together they dropped to their knees. The tongue of flame, quite blue at night, flickered in the night wind. Its ghost candle flare danced unevenly on their bowed heads and averted faces, on Clint and the 2 guards, on the chauffeur waiting below. As widow and brother offered their prayers, the clocks of the Capitol struck midnight, and rising, she carefully gathered her bouquet, laid it on the branches, a last gallant plighting of her troth. Then they turned from the scarred earth, leaving the beacon, and walked down into darkness. On December 1st, Jacqueline Kennedy wrote a letter to Nikita Khrushchev that has never before been published. This is the final thing we get to hear in the article. The White House, Washington. Dear Mr. Chairman, President, I would like to thank you for sending Mr. McCoyan as your representative to my husband's funeral. He looked so upset when he came through the line, and I was very moved. I tried to give him a message for you that day, but as it was such a terrible day for me, I do not know if my words came out as I meant them to. So now, in one of the last nights I will spend in the White House, in one of the last letters I will write on this paper at the White House, I would like to send you my message. I send it only because I know how much my husband cared about peace, and how the relation between you and him was central to his care and his mind. He used to quote your words in some of his speeches. In the next war, the survivors will envy the dead. You and he were adversaries, but you were allied in a determination that the world should not be blown up. You respected each other and could deal with each other. I know that President Johnson will make every effort to establish the same relationship with you. The danger which troubled my husband was that war might be started not so much by the big men as by the little ones. While big men know the needs for self-control and restraint, little men are sometimes moved more by fear and pride. If only in the future the big men can continue to make the little ones sit down and talk before they start to fight. I know that President Johnson will continue the policy in which my husband so deeply believed, a policy of control and restraint, and he will need your help. I send this letter because I know so deeply of the importance of the relationship which existed between you and my husband, and also because of your kindness and that of Mrs. Khrushchev in Vienna. I read that she had tears in her eyes when she left the American Embassy in Moscow after signing the Book of Mourning. Please thank her for that. Sincerely, Jacqueline Kennedy. That's the final letter, the final word we are given. I think it's interesting. We get kind of a mixed view of what Jackie actually thought of Lyndon. I think it's interesting that she kind of bookmarked her discussion of big versus small men by 2 mentions of LBJ. Well, that is the end of William Manchester's selections of The Death of a President in Look magazine. March 7th, 1967 was when this was published. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments what you took away from today's reading and also what you've taken away in general from all 10 of these readings that we've done together. I feel that I've learned so much. It's given such detail, such insight into the moods of the moment. The little things that, you could speed past, you could miss. Decisions about funeral cards. The way that Caroline, her hands reached under as if she wanted to stay close to her daddy. Scrimshaw left in the coffin. Many different details. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you'll come back next time. We are going to have, like I said, 2 episodes. One is about how Joe Kennedy raised all of the Kennedys, and the other one is about his grief over JFK's death, yes, but also the deaths of his other children that had passed at that point. So I hope you'll come back for that. We will see you in the next episode. Have a great day. Bye.